what happened with me and the screw job and the fact that Vince never paid 1 penny to my dad for stealing his territory. Vince McMahon bought my dad's territory from him, $750,000. I never paid him 1 penny after the screw job or after Owen died.
So I was in a position of trying to be professional, and the whole screw job was just a case of somebody insulting you and telling you that he would never ever do anything like that, never do the same favor for you. And I was the champion. I remember, I'm the champion here. I just already promised him I'd drop the belt to him.
I will never forgive Vince McMahon for that. Those are not the words of a bitter man throwing a tantrum after a bad day. Those are the words of someone who has spent decades watching the truth slowly confirm every single thing he already knew in his gut. Bret Hart is not angry because he lost a wrestling match. He is not angry because a business deal went sideways. He is angry because a man he trusted like a father looked him in the eyes, made promises that were supposed to last a lifetime, and then broke every single one of them. Not once, not twice, but over and over again, in ways that cost Bret more than money, more than a championship, more than even his pride. In 2024, the world got a reminder of exactly who Vince McMahon really is. And Bret Hart's response was not surprise. It was the quiet, heavy confirmation of a man who already knew. There is something almost tragic about being right, especially when being right means the worst things you believed about someone you once loved turn out to be completely true. Now, if this story means something to you, if you believe loyalty and honor still matter, take a second right now and give this video some hype using the hype feature. It helps more than you know, and this story genuinely deserves to be heard. Because what we are talking about here is not a grudge. It is not pettiness. It is not the complaints of a man who lost and cannot accept it. It is a man standing completely firm on a set of values that almost nobody else in the wrestling business was willing to defend. Bret Hart grew up in a world where your word was your bond, where you protected your family name above everything else, where the ring was sacred ground, and the people who stepped inside it deserved to be treated with dignity. And one by one, Vince McMahon took all of that and turned it into a transaction. This is the story of exactly how that happened. And to understand it fully, to really feel the weight of it, you need to start not at the beginning, but right where we are now. Let us start with 2024, because that is where Bret's story finds its final shape and its sharpest edge. In early 2024, a woman named Janelle Grant filed a lawsuit against Vince McMahon. The allegations were not vague. They were not the kind of claims that leave room for interpretation or polite skepticism. She alleged sex trafficking, rape, and physical abuse. The kind of accusations that hit the wrestling world like a wall of cold air in a dark room. When the story broke publicly, a lot of people went quiet. The carefully managed narrative around McMahon, the complicated legacy, the business genius framing, all of it went silent for a moment. And then Bret Hart spoke. In an interview that became widely reported, Bret said he has absolutely zero respect for Vince McMahon. Not reduced respect. Not complicated feelings about a complicated man. Zero. He said he felt shame. Deep and very personal shame. Shame that he had ever looked up to this man. Shame that he had ever, in any context at all, called him a father figure. Shame that he had softened his own position at various points over the years for the sake of keeping peace or protecting what was left of their professional relationship. He said knowing what McMahon allegedly became behind closed doors made him regret every single moment of reconciliation he had ever attempted. He said it made him feel sick looking back at the times he had defended the man or given him any benefit of the doubt whatsoever. He also revisited something that had been sitting quietly unaddressed for a long time. Back in 1992, a woman named Rita Chatterton had come forward with rape allegations against McMahon. For years, many people inside the wrestling business had essentially moved past it without giving it the weight it deserved. Bret admitted he had been among those who did not fully reckon with what she said. He said that he now believes her completely, not partially, not with reservations, completely. What the 2024 lawsuit did for Bret was not change his mind about Vince McMahon. His mind had been made up for a very long time. What it did was give a name and a formal legal document and a public record to something Bret had felt in his bones for over 2 decades. It gave a shape to the formless suspicion that had been slowly building since 1996. The man who broke his contract was not just playing hardball in a competitive industry. The man who publicly humiliated him on live television was not just making a difficult executive call. The man who continued a pay-per-view while Bret's brother was dying was not just being a cold businessman weighing costs and benefits. He was, in Bret's view, a predator, a man who had always treated people as objects, things to be used, things to be squeezed for every bit of value they offered, things to be discarded the moment they stopped serving the machine. That is the lens Bret Hart now uses to look back at everything that happened between them. And once you understand that lens, once you hold it up to the full story, everything looks different. Every broken promise, every cold corporate move, every moment when McMahon chose the business over the person, it all fits a pattern that Bret says he should have recognized far sooner than he did. So let us go back, all the way to where it really started, because the permanent hatred between Bret Hart and Vince McMahon did not begin in Montreal in 1997. It did not begin the night Owen fell in 1999. It began with a promise, a very big, very deliberate, very carefully constructed promise designed to exploit the deepest values of a man who was simply too loyal to see it coming. The year was 1996. Bret Hart was the most respected performer in professional wrestling. His reputation was not built on flash or shock value or the ability to create viral moments. It was built on craft, on precision, on the deeply held belief that the ring was a place where a skilled athlete could tell a story so honest and so physically convincing that the audience could not look away. He was meticulous. He was disciplined. He thought about his matches the way a serious musician thinks about a performance. Every element had meaning. Every movement had purpose. His loyalty to the WWF ran in his blood, the same way Stampede Wrestling had run through his family for decades. His father, Stu Hart, had built a wrestling organization in Calgary, Canada, from nothing. Bret had grown up inside that world. He knew what it meant to give your life to this business and to expect that the people around you would honor that sacrifice with some form of reciprocity. He was not simply an employee. He was a son of the tradition. He believed in it the way some people believe in their family values. You did not walk away from it. You protected it. You honored it. You stayed loyal even when staying loyal was hard. And in 1996, his contract with the WWF was nearing its end. World Championship Wrestling came forward with a very serious offer. WCW President Eric Bischoff made the terms clear. It was roughly a 3-year deal worth approximately $9 million. That was not a small or speculative number. That was the highest contract offer ever extended to a performer in professional wrestling at that point in time. For almost any person in almost any profession, that would have been an immediate and enthusiastic yes. The math was simple. $9 million, 3 years, security, freedom, a future entirely on your own terms. But Bret Hart was not thinking in those terms. He was thinking about what walking away would mean, about the relationships he had built, about the family tradition he felt responsible for upholding inside the WWF locker room. He was thinking about what kind of man he wanted to be and whether accepting the offer aligned with the values that defined him. Money was not the only thing that mattered to Bret Hart. That was his strength. And in 1996, Vince McMahon turned it into a vulnerability. McMahon did not come back simply trying to outbid Bischoff on raw dollars. He came back with something designed specifically for a man like Bret, something that could not be countered with a bigger check because it was appealing to something much deeper than financial calculation. He offered a 20-year contract, not 5 years, not a decade, 20 years. A lifetime partnership, a commitment so sweeping and so long that it read less like an employment agreement and more like a declaration of family bond. This contract was presented as proof that Bret's loyalty would be matched, that his decades of service would be honored, that the WWF would always be his home, and that his place within it would evolve and endure long after his body could no longer perform at the highest competitive level. The structure of the deal was built in deliberate phases. In the first 3 years, Bret would be the top active performer in the company, earning $1.5 million per year guaranteed. In years 4 through 6, he would transition into a senior active headliner and mentor role, still earning $1 million a year. From years 7 through 10, the contract moved him into an advisor and agent role, earning between $500,000 and $750,000 annually. And in the final and longest phase, from years 11 through 20, Bret would serve the company as an ambassador and consultant, still drawing $250,000 a year. This was not just a contract. It was a map for the rest of Bret's entire professional life. It told him where he would stand, what his role would be, and what his value to the organization was going to look like for the next 20 years. For a man who had watched his father pour a lifetime into building something, only to see it eventually crumble without institutional support, this contract was the security he had always believed loyalty should earn you. It was confirmation that everything he had given to this company had meant something real and would continue to mean something real. He turned down the $9 million from WCW. He walked away from what might have been the simplest and most financially obvious decision of his career. He chose the promise over the offer. He chose loyalty over money. Less than a year after signing that 20-year commitment, Vince McMahon called Bret into a meeting and told him the company was in serious financial trouble. He said the WWF was in peril. He said it could not honor the contract. He encouraged Bret to go back to WCW and see if those conversations that had been left behind could be reopened. Whether that financial hardship was real has been questioned seriously by people who followed WWF business closely during that period. At the very same time, McMahon was telling his most loyal champion that the company could not afford to keep its promise. The organization was preparing for a future public offering that would bring in substantial capital. And it was simultaneously preparing to pay Mike Tyson $3 million for a single appearance at WrestleMania 14. $3 million for one night, for one person who had nothing to do with the wrestling business in any sustained way. But the 20-year promise made to the man who had turned down $9 million out of loyalty could not be honored. Bret Hart described the moment McMahon told him the company was backing out with a phrase that cut straight to what it actually felt like. He said it was like a father telling his son he did not want him anymore. Not a boss making a painful business call, a father rejecting his son. That framing is the key to understanding how personal this was and how deliberately McMahon had constructed the relationship to feel that personal. He had cultivated Bret's emotional investment in the company the same way you cultivate a deep family bond. And then, when the contract became inconvenient, he discarded it. The loyalty that had been nurtured and encouraged and held up as something meaningful was revealed to be a management tool, something McMahon had used to keep his best performer in place until the moment that performer was no longer as strategically valuable as he once was. That is pillar number 4, the financial betrayal. The exploitation of a loyal man's deepest values in service of a bottom line that Bret Hart was never truly a meaningful partner in. But Bret still had to leave. He was going to WCW. And before he left, there was one final piece of unfinished business: the WWF Championship. Bret was the champion, and the question of how that title would change hands became the second great act in the story of this betrayal. Pillar number 3, Montreal. November 9th, 1997, Survivor Series. The city of Montreal, Quebec, Canada, Bret Hart's home country, the place where the fans had always recognized him as their own, and where the name Hart still carried a weight that went beyond wrestling. And it was here, in front of his own people, in his own territory, that Vince McMahon committed what most people who were there and have studied it since consider the single most calculated act of professional betrayal the wrestling industry has ever witnessed. Bret's contract contained a specific and limited protection. It was called reasonable creative control. This clause existed for the final 30 days of his time with the company. It gave him a legal right to protect the presentation and integrity of the Hitman character during his transition away from the WWF. It was a reasonable and bounded provision, the kind of protection that a performer with nearly 20 years of loyal service to an organization had plainly earned many times over. Bret used that clause to refuse one specific outcome. He would not lose the championship to Shawn Michaels in Montreal. His reasons were real and layered. Michaels was not merely a character rival in a storyline. The personal tension between them was genuine and well documented within the locker room. Michaels had told Bret directly and explicitly that he would never return the favor of losing to him. And beyond the personal dimension, losing the title in Canada felt like something different, something more weighted. Bret was a Canadian icon. That building in Montreal was not just another arena on another stop of a touring schedule. It was his ground, his people, his country. Title the following night on Monday Night Raw. He offered to lose to Ken Shamrock. He offered to lose to The Undertaker. There were multiple genuine paths to resolving the situation without violating the contractual protection he had been given and had a clear legal right to use. McMahon presented him with a plan. He told Bret the match would end in a disqualification. The agreed finish involved Bret being placed in his own finishing hold, the sharpshooter, reversing it, and then a chaotic brawl breaking out that would end without a clean finish. No submission, no pinfall, no humiliation, no violation of the clause. Bret agreed. He trusted that agreement. He went into the arena that night believing the plan was real. It was not real. The actual plan had been coordinated in secret among a small and deliberate group of people. McMahon, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, and referee Earl Hebner all knew what was going to happen. Bret did not. During the match, Michaels locked Bret into the sharpshooter. Bret had not submitted. He had not tapped the mat. He was still fighting. And then McMahon, positioned at ringside, turned toward the timekeeper and shouted for the bell to be rung. Hebner immediately called the match over. He signaled for the end. Michaels was declared the winner by submission. The WWF Championship changed hands on the basis of a finish that never actually took place. Bret Hart's own finishing hold had been used against him. His contractual protection had been ignored. His championship had been taken from him through a coordinated deception in his home country, in front of his own people, on live television that went out to the world. What happened in that building was not an executive booking decision. It was not a tough call made under difficult circumstances. It was a planned robbery of dignity, executed by people who had agreed to one thing and then done something entirely different while Bret was standing in the ring, unable to stop it. When he understood what had just happened, Bret found Vince McMahon backstage. He punched him. One punch, a full, clean, real punch. McMahon went down. By multiple accounts, he was unconscious for several minutes. People stood around looking at him. Bret broke his hand throwing that punch. He has called it the sweetest thing he ever did. And when you hold the full weight of everything that led to that moment, you understand exactly why. That punch was not just an emotional outburst. It was the only response Bret Hart had left. The broken contract of 1996 had already stripped him of financial trust. The events of November 9th had just stripped him of his championship, his contractual protection, and his dignity in front of his own country. The betrayal had actually cost. But even the betrayal had actually cost. But even all of that, the broken contract, the stolen championship, the calculated humiliation, even those did not represent the floor of this relationship. Because there is a level of betrayal that sits in a completely different category. There is the level that involves death, that involves blood, that involves a brother who fell and never got back up, and an institution that kept the cameras rolling anyway. Pillar number 2, Owen. May 23, 1999, Over the Edge pay-per-view, Kansas City, Missouri. Bret's younger brother, Owen Hart, was performing that night as the Blue Blazer. The Blue Blazer was a masked, caped character that Bret and Owen's widow, Martha, have described as a form of marginalization or punishment. After the Montreal Screwjob and Bret's departure to WCW, under the most dramatic and public circumstances imaginable, the WWF's relationship with the remaining members of the Hart family became strained and complicated. Owen was talented and hardworking, but he was being asked to wear a mask and play a character that kept him from being fully himself, while the industry around him shifted towards something louder and more spectacle-driven. The storyline that night called for the Blue Blazer to make a dramatic entrance by descending from the ceiling of the arena. It was the kind of visual moment the Attitude Era loved. Big, theatrical, designed to generate excitement and give the crowd something to react to before the actual competition began. Owen was connected to a harness and a release mechanism for the descent. And everything about that setup was wrong in ways that reflected not a single oversight, but a series of choices all pointing in the same direction. The harness Owen was wearing was not a vertical rappelling harness designed for safely lowering a person from a significant height. It was a horizontal dragging harness the kind used in film productions where performers are pulled sideways rather than lowered vertically. The release mechanism attached to the harness was not a heavy-duty carabiner built for load-bearing safety. It was a sailboat clip, a quick-release clip of the kind you find on a boat to rapidly free a line. That clip could be triggered by approximately 6 pounds of pressure. To put that into context, 6 pounds of pressure is roughly equivalent to pulling the trigger on a firearm. Any movement by Owen during the descent, any slight shift in his body, any tension on the wrong part of the harness could release the clip and send him falling. The crew responsible for operating the rigging equipment had not been selected for their qualifications in aerial safety or theatrical rigging work. They had been hired for cost efficiency, not for expertise, not for their training or certification, for cost efficiency. Owen fell. He struck the ring turnbuckle. He was rushed to the hospital. He died that night. He was 34 years old. Bret Hart has been consistent and clear about how he sees this event. He does not call it an accident. He calls it pure negligence. The wrong harness for the wrong application. A release mechanism with a pressure threshold so low that normal movement could trigger it. An unqualified crew in charge of an inherently dangerous operation. None of those decisions were forced on anyone. They were choices made within a system that was willing to accept a level of risk with a human being's life that it would not have accepted with a piece of expensive equipment or a valuable piece of broadcast infrastructure. But the equipment failure and the personnel decisions are only one part of what Bret carries from this. The other part is what happened after Owen fell. The show continued. While Owen Hart was on the arena floor, while emergency personnel were working on him, while performers backstage were beginning to understand in fragments and pieces that something had gone terribly wrong, the over-the-edge pay-per-view kept going. The cameras continued rolling. Matches continued. McMahon made the decision that the event would not be stopped. His stated defense, repeated in various interviews and documentary settings, was that as a businessman, he felt the show had to continue for the people who had purchased tickets and paid for the broadcast. Bret Hart has a way of describing that decision that needs no elaboration. He has said that McMahon stepped over his brother's blood for a buy rate. And Bret has asked a question that cuts directly to the moral center of what really happened that night. He has asked whether the event would have continued if the person who fell had been Shane McMahon, Vince's own son. Everyone who hears that question understands exactly what the answer would have been. The show would have stopped instantly, without hesitation or calculation. If it had been his son on that floor, Vince McMahon would not have asked a single question about buy rates or ticket holders or production schedules. He would have shut it all down without a second thought. But Owen Hart was not his son. Owen Hart was a performer, an asset in the production. And in Bret's view, the decision to continue the show was the most complete and undeniable proof of how McMahon actually saw the people who work for him. Not as human beings with children and families and people who love them, as parts in the machine. Then Martha Hart filed a wrongful death lawsuit. She wanted accountability. She wanted the legal record to reflect what had happened and who was responsible. The WWF countersued her. The company filed legal action against a grieving widow, the mother of Owen's 2 children, claiming breach of contract. They deployed their legal resources against a woman who had done nothing except try to get justice for her husband's death. From that moment, Bret Hart's non-forgiveness became something that no amount of time, no business reconciliation, and no future event would ever be able to move. He had already processed the financial betrayal. He had already survived the professional crime in Montreal. But watching his brother die, watching the show go on while it happened, and then watching the company sue Owen's widow, that combination placed Vince McMahon permanently outside any framework Bret could use to consider forgiveness. And still, Vince McMahon was not finished with Bret Hart. Pillar number 1, the ideological war. The institutional attempt to erase the legacy entirely. After Bret left the company, after Owen died, after every practical connection between them had ended, McMahon still held something that Bret could not simply ignore. He held the archives, the footage, the platform, the ability to shape how millions of wrestling fans across the world would remember Bret Hart and what the hitman's career had actually meant. And at one point, he appeared prepared to use all of that as a weapon against the man he had already betrayed in every other way. In 2005, WWE began developing a DVD project originally titled Screwed, the Bret Hart story. If that title sounds familiar, it should. The project was modeled directly after a DVD called The Self-Destruction of the Ultimate Warrior, which was released that same year. That documentary was widely described at the time and since as a coordinated burial. It was not an honest examination of a career with complicated elements. It was a platform using official WWE production resources and the credibility of official WWE media for former colleagues and company voices to systematically tear down a man's legacy, reframe his career in the worst possible terms, and leave audiences with an image of someone undeserving of the respect they had been given. The Screwed DVD was reportedly going to follow that same blueprint for Bret. There were plans to include interviews with people like Hulk Hogan, who would allege that Bret was using Owen's death as a weapon, that he was, in the framing reported about the project, exploiting his brother's memory to fuel his grudge against the company. The intent appeared to be converting Bret Hart in the public record from the excellence of execution into a bitter and self-absorbed man who was incapable of letting go and who had spent years weaponizing family tragedy for personal purposes. When Bret understood what was being planned, he made a calculated decision. He cooperated with WWE. He gave interviews. He engaged. He allowed them access. Not because he had forgiven anyone, not because he was prepared to bury the past. He did it because he understood something very clearly about the power dynamics involved. If he stayed away, the story would be told without him. McMahon's company had the footage, the production resources, the platform, and the motivation. If Bret did not show up to defend his own name, the official version of Bret Hart's career would be written entirely by the people who had the most to gain from making him look small. His cooperation was not reconciliation. It was self-preservation. It was a man defending his own name because he knew someone else was preparing to take it apart. Some people pointed to that cooperation, particularly around 2005 and again in 2010, as signs that the relationship had softened. It had not. Bret was managing a threat. There is an enormous difference between those two things. There was also a deeper ideological dimension to this conflict that never fully resolved itself. Bret Hart views himself as a craftsman in the truest sense of that word. His career was built on the conviction that what happened inside the ring should be physically real, athletically demanding, and emotionally genuine. He has consistently described his best matches as a form of art, as something that went beyond entertainment and touched something real in the people watching it. He believed the ring was a serious and meaningful place. McMahon rebuilt the WWF around something completely different in the late 1990s. He repositioned the company under the banner of sports entertainment, a term that deliberately distanced what the company did from the tradition of professional wrestling. The products shifted toward raunchiness, shock value, and the kind of loud, transgressive spectacle that generated controversy and media coverage. The careful, precise, disciplined work that the Hart family had spent decades developing was pushed aside in favor of something that played better in sound bites and generated different kinds of headlines. For Bret, this was not just a business evolution he disagreed with. It felt like a direct repudiation of everything he had devoted his life to. And the character that came to define and represent that new era was McMahon himself, the evil boss, the corrupt authority figure who would do anything, cross any line, break any agreement to maintain control. That character was not invented from nothing. It was born directly and explicitly out of what happened in Montreal. McMahon had taken the worst thing he had ever done to Bret Hart, had taken the professional crime he had committed against the most loyal performer in his company, and had turned it into an entertainment persona. And then 2024 arrived. The Janelle Grant lawsuit did something very precise for Bret Hart. It did not introduce him to a version of McMahon he had never considered. It gave formal legal language and a public record to a pattern he had been describing in different ways for over 20 years. The lawsuit described a man who allegedly treated people as objects to be controlled and used and discarded. A man who allegedly leveraged his power to take what he wanted from people who were not in a position to protect themselves from him. When Bret heard those allegations, he did not respond with measured skepticism or careful neutrality. He said he felt shame for every moment he had given this man any form of credit. He said he felt sick looking back at any time he had softened his position. He revisited Rita Chatterton's allegations from 1992. He said he believes her completely. His current position is absolute zero respect. Not a trace of professional regard, not a remnant of the complicated feelings that had ebbed and flowed over the decades. Nothing. Bret Hart will not forgive Vince McMahon. That is not going to change. And looking at everything we now know, looking at the full weight of the evidence that has accumulated across nearly 30 years, that refusal is not a flaw. It is perhaps the most honest and consistent thing about him. It is the choice of a man who decided a very long time ago that his values were worth more than his comfort. And no matter how many years pass, no matter how the industry evolves and moves on, no matter how history tries to soften the jagged edges and make things cleaner and more forgivable than they actually are, Bret Hart's position stays exactly where it has always been. Some betrayals do not deserve forgiveness. Some wounds are too deliberate and too deep and too connected to too many other wounds to be erased by the passage of time. Bret Hart has known that his entire life. He knows it now more clearly and more completely than he ever has before. And in a world that too often rewards those who look the other way, there is something genuinely powerful and quietly inspiring about a man who simply refuses to.